All right, thank you, everyone. So I want to introduce our first panel of the session, really. They are going to speak about where environmentalism and trade issues can coincide and sometimes collide. There's going to be a heavy focus on decarbonization and carbon credits, something that you heard both Alex and Steve mention in their talks on Sunday. And so I'm going to go down the line here a bit. So first we have Lynette Chia. She is a professor of engineering at Singapore University of Technology and Design. She's going to talk about the carbon footprint of e-commerce shipping options. And then we have Genevieve Soh. She is the head of platforms and ecosystems at Climate Impact X, which is a marketplace for a global marketplace for carbon credits, and she'll explain how those are being used. Then we have Audrey Tan, who is the editor and environment correspondent for the Straits Times here, and Melissa Lowe, who's a researcher for nature-based climate solutions at NUS. And they both will talk about kind of how to go about pursuing these stories and also how to have good relationships between researchers and journalists to kind of get the best results. So let's welcome them, and Lynette will kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us on the panel this morning, and very nice to meet all of you. Happy to share a little bit about myself and my research with everyone today. So my name is Lynette Chia. I'm an associate professor with the Singapore University of Technology and Design, which is one of the universities here in Singapore. And here are my slides. I think they're already up, so let me try to click through them. Today I wanted to talk about e-commerce and online shipping and all the impacts that it has. I mean, that's related very much to the global trade networks that we have now. But let me kick off by introducing my lab and what we do at the Sustainable Urban Mobility Lab. So we work a lot on transportation modeling and simulation, and we're looking at ways to promote sustainable transportation in cities in particular. So I'll talk a bit about the project that I'm doing on e-commerce and the impact of shipping, but I've also done some work, we've also done a lot of work on life cycle assessments of different automobile technologies, some ideas like crowd shipping. I won't go too much into those details, but I'll give you a sense of one of the projects. I'll start off with the context. I think we know that climate change is happening and a growing and pressing problem. If we look at the major groups of greenhouse gases, we know that CO2, carbon dioxide, is one of the major gases, and much of it is due to the burning of fossil fuels that very much drives transportation today. So transportation is very much dominated by the use of fossil fuels, and it's quite challenging, right, to sort of ease our way out of it. But we're seeing it in our lifetime, and I think it's quite an exciting time to see this change happening before us. So we're to break down the different kinds of greenhouse gas emissions by the different sectors, energy use, again, for the different purposes like industry, transportation dominates the release of greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the transportation wedge at the bottom right, you'll see that transportation is responsible for about 16% of total greenhouse gas emissions today. And we see that if we were to split it up a little bit, right, to sort of dissect the different kinds of transportation services that we need, about a dominant part is passenger transport, but a very big part is also freight transportation. So we talk about moving passengers around the city. Like this morning, I had some trouble getting in because the bus was a little bit late. But we're also moving a lot of goods around the city. So there's urban goods movement happening around, and we see that trend rising, right? Another thing that this chart shows is the growth in demand. So that's something that we always contend with while we are introducing new solutions and technologies to address climate change. We are also trying to address this growth in demand and how can we level off CO2 when demand is rising. So in terms of freight transportation in cities, I think we've all witnessed that, buying things online or looking at trucks coming and going. There are a few key trends. I think there's competing land uses in cities that really make it more challenging to deliver goods now. I already spoke about the demand growth, increasing e-commerce. I think through the pandemic, right, we're buying more things online, meals being delivered to us rather than us going out of the home. And then there are issues and externalities like idling, congestion, pollution, and all these impacts. From the industry's perspective, it's also very challenging. We need to coordinate these deliveries and make sure that all the stakeholders are accounted for. This is about e-commerce. Global e-commerce is growing very much. Let me skip to the next one, which tries to show this a little bit better. So I thought I'll focus a bit on Southeast Asia a bit, because I understand a lot of the members of our audience are from the region. There's a lot of drivers for e-commerce, and it's growing really rapidly. It's a very exciting time for all these e-commerce players, but we see that there are also challenges associated with it. And much of the drive, is associated with this new commercial sort of channels that are now available to everyone, and there's emergence of a growing middle class that want to buy more things, right? Like bigger homes, and want to fill it up with even more things. So just some images to sort of portray, what's happening on the ground. I mean, warehouse activities, deliveries, actually quite innovative. There's a lot of innovation in this space. A lot of platforms coming forward to match delivery services with consumers, as well as the sellers that want to make all these things happen. So we see electric delivery bikes, coming up, some cash on delivery forms of payment happening too. So quite an exciting space. But at the same time, of course, a lot of emissions, right, associated with it. So when we look at international freight emissions, much of it comes from longer distances. We are now demanding our goods from afar, not just domestic trade, but also international trade, right? And these networks are becoming more complex and growing and more extensive. And they are also arguably less efficient. With the complexity, it makes it less efficient also to be able to coordinate the deliveries and more carbon intensive. So one of the studies that one of my students did was to look at carbon labeling for shipping options on online shipping channels. So, studies have found that, if you were to label the carbon emissions associated with air travel, for example, when you buy your air ticket, you might be more considerate of what options are present to you, and you might consider, abating some of those emissions. So in our research, we try to look at what's the carbon footprint of different shipping options, and will labeling help, right? Can it help us reduce overall emissions? So the student and I, when we looked at Taobao, which is a very popular e-commerce platform. How many of you have shopped at Taobao before? A few might have heard of it. It's quite dominant in Asian e-commerce. It's one of the top 10 e-commerce sites, and it's quite popular. And there are many shipping options offered. So what we did was we tried to break down the different components of transportation that has to happen to get that product to your door. And then there are different combinations, right? You could consolidate some orders, you could have it delivered to a locker and you pick it up from there, or it sends to your home. So we tried to break down the different components, and these are some of the results of the shipping options. So let me walk through this one a little bit more carefully. There are 5 different possible combinations of deliveries that can happen for you to get that product. You could order it and get it shipped by sea or by air. We find that that decision is one of the most dominant ones that affects overall carbon emissions. So if you ship it by sea, your total emissions will be about 1.19 kilograms of CO2 equivalent for that package. If by air, it tends to be hover around 7 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So the difference is quite stark. Of course, sea versus air shipping, there's a different speed involved. You have to wait a bit more if it's shipped to you by sea rather than by air, regarding this cross-border interaction. And then further on, whether you collect it at the locker or at your doorstep, it doesn't really matter that much, given that dominant emissions arising from air travel. So I mean, one of the main takeaways, of course, is the air emissions tends to be quite high. Later on, we did this experiment, sort of posing different options as a survey to different consumers to ask them what are they more willing to pay for. Given, do you want a faster or slower delivery time? Do you want it cheaper? Most people want it cheaper, direct when you buy or make your orders online. So we presented some options to them. This is a stated preference survey. So we asked them, given this option, which one would you choose, given the scenario of your package and how quickly you might need it. And one of them has a label, one of them doesn't, right? So in the end, we discovered these consumer preferences. Mostly everyone would prefer cheaper first. You prefer free delivery. But there were, more than half were actually willing to compromise the speed of the delivery for a greener alternative. So it's consistent with what we saw with the air travel study. And if you were to present this information to consumers, it might actually influence their decision on choosing the slower option, maybe the sea shipping as opposed to air shipping, and then maybe at the same price, but they're willing to wait in that sense for their parcels. So key takeaways, I think emissions can vary, but slower emissions in slower modes of transportation in general it's going to cost less and emit less carbon dioxide. And this is more sensitive to the choice of sea or air freight. So maybe the next time you shop, you might be more careful and think about that. And then it seems like green labels would definitely help. Overall, in terms of transportation, as individuals, we also have some choices. So all these different ways to alternatives or options that we have can actually help to reduce overall emissions, things like sharing your vehicle, taking public transport, buying local, and things like that. So that's a summary. I don't think I exceeded. I think it's just on time, 10 minutes here. So thank you, and welcome any questions.
Does anyone have any burning questions for Lynette? Otherwise, we'll go next to...
Just one question.
Yeah.
What is your observation?
One second.
What do you think? Do you think that e-commerce has led to more carbon emissions vis-a-vis, when individuals used to go to the shop and buy?
Yeah.
Or has it cut down emissions?
Yeah, that's a very context-specific question. That's a really good one. We also try to investigate that. It's highly complex because it depends on, like, for example, browsing trips. So you might make a passenger. Previously, we'll go to a shop, right? We'll make a passenger trip, go to the store, pick up, come back. But sometimes people are now going to the store, browsing, and then they click online, right, to buy something. So it might, in some cases, it actually generates more trips. In some cases, we see the other phenomena. So it varies. Yeah.
Hi everyone. As I was introduced earlier, I'm Genevieve. I am part of the Climate Impact X team. So that's a carbon credit marketplace and exchange based here in Singapore. So I think Lynette just walked us through quite a bit of detail around how emissions are generated specifically to transportation and specifically with the e-commerce study. At the macro level, I think the world is dealing with a specific carbon budget that suggests that if we wanted to keep on a 1.5 or 2 degree pathway to avoid catastrophe, a lot of that has to come from reduction. So all the smart choices you saw in the earlier presentation. But the science also suggests that you won't quite get there with just reductions, and you need people to be actively trying to take carbon dioxide out of the existing atmosphere or avoiding additional tons, and that comes through what we think green financing can play a role in. So to support projects that would have otherwise not been done to remove carbon out of the atmosphere, and this is where carbon credits come in to play a role. So what we do at CIX really is we've identified that money going into those types of projects is really valuable for the world, but that type of financing typically is hindered by a lack of trust. Because if someone told you, hey, give me $20, I promise to plant a tree in a location far away from you, and trust me, the tree's there, there's usually exactly that sort of reaction, right? Like, yeah, right. So what we found was that while this was a proven method to direct financing to such valuable projects, people stopped because they weren't sure about what was going on with that money and whether or not it would cause the impact it really needed to. So we really focus on trying to bring transparency, integrity, and trust to the space by employing a multitude of different techniques, including working really closely with scientists, all the way to employ technology where it does have an impact, to help people find a place where they can go and know that the credits there have gone through that additional layer of due diligence. But first off, what is a carbon credit? I don't assume most people know what that is, but if you started on step number 1 there, where businesses and individuals emit greenhouse gases just in the course of daily life, all of that goes into the atmosphere and forms part of that carbon budget we had talked about. And really, if you start to switch off the lights, switch to electric vehicles, you start to avoid additional, that red bubble going up into the atmosphere. But if you wanted to actively take it down, projects such as, the replanting of trees or mineralization or different sorts of technologies can actually take that CO2 out of the atmosphere. And what we're really looking to do is then pay those people who are doing these projects for that effort. So the way this works is a carbon credit will then be given to that person who either went out to plant the tree or did something to that effect. And the person who bought that credit then ideally should be able to, in our language, retire that credit. So you take that piece of paper that says this ton of carbon dioxide was taken out of the atmosphere, you cancel it somewhere, and you report it against your footprint. So you say, I emitted 100 tons of carbon dioxide this last year. I tried really hard this year to switch to electric, and I dropped that from 100 to 80. And for the remaining of the 80, I bought credits, canceled them, and therefore this year have come to a net position that tries to deal with those emissions, right? And that appropriate hierarchy needs to be put in place. So to allow for that, then how do these credits actually get generated? Usually it starts right at the top where someone has an idea and they need some money to go and study, hey, is this project feasible? So they do a feasibility assessment. This has to do with figuring out if the project is viable, if it qualifies under a specific method, if the science supports what they're trying to do. And if that happens, they go out ahead and develop that project. So from the day you have the idea to the day you get your first credit is usually at least 1 to 2 years, sometimes even longer, especially if you're planting a brand new tree. It just takes time for the tree to grow. So it's a long time before they get to that validation and verification. And someone literally comes to your project and says, did you do the work you said you did? And if so, you get those credits that you can then sell and trade for money that then refinances that project. So that's kind of how a carbon credit works in a basic life cycle. I mentioned there are a lot of different ways to generate carbon credits. Broadly, carbon credits break down into 2 styles, an avoided credit and a removal credit. Avoided credit is, if you didn't do this project, this ton of CO2 would have gone into the atmosphere. So this is, I stopped the tree from getting cut down. A removal credit is one where you actively, from the existing atmosphere, take out CO2. So this is, I plant a new tree, and that tree grows up, and the carbon stored in its biomass. These 2 styles also have a technology versus a nature angle. So nature is what I've already given you an example of, but technology, for example, in renewable energy, it's avoided fossil fuel burning to produce electricity. Instead, use renewable sources, and with technology-based removals, you have direct air capture, for example, which is quite literally a vacuum in the sky, taking out CO2 and storing it somewhere safe where it won't come back out again. These all sound great, but they vary significantly in its availability by technology types. It also varies significantly in cost. So on one end, you can buy a nature avoidance credit for something like 10 to 15 US dollars a ton. On the other end, you could be paying somewhere closer to $500 to $1,000 per ton for the technology removal style credits. But its relative availability also reflects those price points. There are very little technology removal credits in the world today, and much more abundant ones via nature. So all this is to say that the way you can generate a carbon credit is quite quite varied. And it takes me then to the point around, so who's buying these credits and what are they doing with it? And how big is this market, so on and so forth. At the heart of it, the people looking to buy these carbon credits today are companies who have made certain claims about how they're going to get, and this term net zero has been thrown around a lot. Basically, they've made a claim around how they're going to reduce their carbon emissions and get to a place where, as far as they can, they'll take down whatever CO2 they can avoid, and anything left behind that they cannot avoid because it's really expensive to do so, or the technology isn't quite there for them to do it, they'll use carbon credits to try and get that last bit across the line. Traditionally, in 2020, this voluntary carbon market was something like 100 million tons of issuances a year. I think it was 200 tons last year. And forecasts for this are expected to grow by 10x by 2030, and more than that by 2050. And it just reflects essentially, if we needed to stay on the 1 degree pathway, if we threw all of the science at it, there's still a gap, and this gap is where carbon credits come to play. I think with this, what we would probably want to say is that voluntary carbon markets actually have been around for quite a long time. I think they started with also the Kyoto Protocol, and what they struggled with those is this trust element, right? So some of the studies that have been able to study the early era of these carbon markets, these credits, suggest that a good chunk of them were kind of not additive to the world. So what that meant is that someone built a renewable energy plant that was going to be built anyway, and then they sold the credits anyway. So the world net didn't really benefit from it, for example. So a lot of the work that's gone in, and you'll see this very much in the space of where we work and where a lot of great minds are thinking, is around how do we help people figure out which of these credits are considered high quality. This is, I think, also working in tandem with the flip side, so the compliance markets. So everything I've talked about so far is what we call the voluntary markets, where a company goes out and says, I want to do this out of my own volition. That's sometimes not quite enough. So we'll see a lot of countries set up compliance markets. And the most famous or well-known of them is the one in the EU ETS. This is where a country or a region or some sort of regulatory jurisdiction says, well, we'll decide how much all of us in this room can emit together. And you get a budget of 10, and you get a budget of 8, and you get a budget of 6, and it's a classical cap and trade type play. And so the compliance markets actually have taken on in quite a meaningful way. I believe there's nearly 80 such schemes globally today that cover 1 in 5 emissions. In addition to that, Singapore has also announced a renewal or an enhancement to its own compliance markets. So prior to this year, Singapore was already having a carbon tax that was, in fact, it was a $5 per ton carbon tax. They've made announcements at this year's budget about how that $5 will go to $25 by 24, and will go to somewhere between $50 and $80 by the end of the decade. And that they'll use a set of carbon credits or allow some of these companies to use carbon credits to kind of supplement the taxation budget. So what that tells you is that the two worlds are a little bit melding together, that the compliance markets and voluntary markets, there's an interplay between them. So I kind of really covered that around the Singapore markets and what we're thinking out here around that interplay. But really, I think the message we want to leave people with is whether or not you are being compelled by a local jurisdiction or otherwise, most companies really do have incentive or reason to start to care about that low carbon transition. Many of them will be either forced by their customers or by their shareholders or by banks who are willing to lend at cheaper rates if they perform along a set of E/F/G criteria. And regardless, the way this needs to happen in our minds is that companies first need to measure their baselines. They need to set targets which are transparent and reportable. And then step 2 is actually reduction. So doing the hard yards to actually take down the amount of consumption to begin with. And then the third piece is where they specifically use high quality carbon credits, the ones we've been talking about, and really compensate on the route to net zero. The idea being that don't wait till that very last year where you have your target and buy your carbon credits. You should be funding the journey all the way to that point to be able to achieve what we term as the high ambition pathway. What CIX is doing in this space is, given all of the things I've talked about, it's like, so how do I buy a carbon credit and how do I know I'm paying a fair price? So a lot of the work we've done is to try to bring together the venues where companies can come, browse, and do a lot of that due diligence in a simple way and check out with a few simple clicks. They can also retire very transparently and trace all of that so that they can report credibly to their stakeholders. I think what you'll see here is that we hold a very specific view that it doesn't just stop at creating almost an Amazon-style B2B marketplace, because companies who are looking to just buy to retire, that fits just that piece of the need. There are a few other use cases here we think need to be supported. On the far right-hand side, you'll see the exchange. What's different here is that in the project marketplace, you're buying a specific project in a specific location with specific characteristics, but that pricing that you can discover there is quite unique. So it's what that specific thing costs. But if you are planning for 5 years out, 10 years out, and you know that your carbon prices are fluctuating significantly and you want to hedge, or if you're an investor and you're about to put $20 million into a project and you don't know what those credits could catch for you in 5 years, 10 years, that really stops you again from investing or putting that green financing to work. So what the exchange does is really try to discover those forward prices so that if you wanted to make a business plan around it, you can. And today, if someone asks you, what is the price of voluntary carbon? It's quite surprising. Nobody can give you a really good price. because there isn't that reference price. Whereas if all of us were to say, what's the price of oil today? You would go to either the Brent indicator or the WTI indicator. Those things don't exist in the carbon markets, and it hinders trade and it hinders investment. So our venues are set up to be able to deal with those sorts of frictions and try to bring to life all the necessary infrastructure to bring more financing to the types of projects that will do that sequestration activity that we want to see in the world. I think the one thing we would say is that our conversations with many people in this ecosystem are such that most people are on a learning journey, and we actively kind of try to build community around it. So for people in this room or otherwise, feel free to kind of connect with us. I think a lot of times we're interested in that nexus between science and the markets, bring to bear kind of the technologies that do the sequestration work and making sure those people get paid a fair price for it. So I'll just stop there and maybe take any questions from the group. Yes.
Hi, Ben Scott from Bloomberg, Australia. There's recently been a massive controversy in Australia because most of our carbon credits turned out to be complete garbage. What sort of international regulations are there around ensuring carbon credits are actually high quality, or is it at this point, is it far more a national, country by country type system?
No, it's a good question, and I'll be the first to admit I don't know the details of the Australian scandal. But I think there are 2 or 3 different kind of bodies that judge quality. So it usually starts with where are you using these credits. So if you're using them in Australia to meet a local regulated requirement, it's usually that local regulator that tells you what is a good credit. So very specifically to Australia, they use a scheme called the ACCUs, and those set out rules upon which people can generate credits, and that's how they judge good enough. The second set, that is what we consider to be the voluntary carbon markets. This tends to be quite borderless. And what you'll see in this space is that essentially business alliances like the ICVCM, which is based out of London but has a 400-man strong consultation group, those guys are trying to articulate for the world what does a good carbon credit look like, from certain methodologies, from certain vintages, so on and so forth. And they're trying to set out a blueprint so the average person understands what is good enough and should be broadly accepted. Then there's a third group, which is industry-oriented. So the most established is actually the airline group. So the aviation industry body, ICAO, has set out rules under something called CORSIA, C-O-R-S-I-A, and they've defined what is good enough for an airline to use. So it really depends on who's using it and on what basis this line is being drawn. But honestly, at this point, there is no one standard that everyone kind of abides by. And a lot of times what's influencing these quality bars are probably 2 big tensions. One is wanting to do good and ensuring the science is there, but also the other side being practicality around if you draw the bar so high that every credit is $1,000 a ton, it just stops people from wanting to try and get involved to begin with, right? So I think therein lies the natural tension. And it really then is where companies seek safety, either in numbers or behind business groups, so they're not acting alone, at least are adhering to what peers would consider good enough. Yeah. Yes?
Hello, this is Sam Khan from Pakistan. So I know many organizations in Pakistan who are planting trees to get carbon credits. So my question is this helpful, like someone sitting in developed countries who are contributing towards creating carbon emissions, and someone who is sitting in developing countries to get planting trees and working for the environment. So how can you justify the both things? Is it helpful to the environment all around, like what?
So I think that's a really tough question. And what I'd say to it is, if we think about the carbon budget for the world, it doesn't discriminate between whether the CO2 was sequestered in country A or B, the total carbon budget shared across the planet. And with regards to developing nations doing the work of sequestration versus developed nations kind of doing the historical polluting, I think the historical polluting is just a fact of what has already happened. a lot of the activity that's happening today is one that demands actors in developed nations to do that task of reducing. But if the marginal cost of sequestering the next ton of carbon is cheaper in developing nations, what we should be ensuring to do is to ensure that we pay a fair price. So it's almost like the global north paying for essentially the sequestration happening in the global south, because the marginal cost of abatement tends to be cheaper there. What I think is being discussed a lot at COP is around ensuring that that doesn't become a hindrance for developing nations to also essentially grow their economies. And so I think there's quite a delicate balance there. I'm not sure I'd have the pedigree to say what's right or wrong, but I do think a lot of the meaningful minds are trying to ensure that this is equitable. Oh. No problem.
Hi, I'm Jane from Bloomberg News in Seoul. I was just wondering if you see any cases that raises any questions for you on the effectiveness of the companies, whether they are really going green or just trying to be sort of like so-called greenwashing. Because now I'm working on a story about the green and also carbon credits. This is a Korean cement company that is burning garbage. They are burning waste plastics a lot, and they say they are replacing coals. And so that by doing so, they say they are reducing carbons. but actually, as you know, burning plastic also emits a lot of harmful gases and also carbon emissions as well. So I was wondering if how you think about their claim first, and then just if you see any kind of other cases that makes you think, this company might be just not enough to get carbon credits, because this Korean cement company is getting carbon credits from the Korean government, and the Korean government is actually encouraging other cement makers to use more plastics to replace the coals, and then it is one of their net zero goals. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I mean, I don't have the details on what exactly that company is doing, but the first thing I'd say is the bar on what good green action is rising, and it's rising rapidly. I think folks who made any sort of claims around neutrality or net zero in the last 5 to 10 years would probably not stand up to that sort of scrutiny today, and that's a good thing. I think one of the key developments that folks should pay attention to is the work coming out of the VCMI action. So that is another group of NGOs plus companies plus scientists coming together to help companies articulate what is a fair and good claim. I think the first thing they demand is essentially that an emissions baseline that is auditable is established and targets set and reported every 3 to 5 years. And then on top of that, their ability to show that they're on track, so that then after that they can use carbon credits appropriately in that hierarchy. So I think increasingly they're setting the standard around what sort of claims can be made and what good looks like. But for any individual company, I think bringing together that holistic view does take time. So I do think a lot of the scrutiny today is good, keeps people on their toes. But it's also, I think, a bit of a journey for a lot of companies to essentially mature along. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to the National Press Foundation for having me. My name is Audrey, and I'm a journalist like you guys. I work for the Straits Times here in Singapore. I guess our beats are kind of different because I've been working for the paper for about 10 years now, and my focus had always been about the environment. So I started out reporting on cats and dogs and domestic animal welfare issues, and then I have moved on to broader biodiversity conservation stuff, and now climate change, climate science and policy. So I did a 1-year master's degree in climate science and policy at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in 2018 to 2019. And the moment I came back to Singapore, our Prime Minister announced that climate change is such an existential threat for our country that we need to spend $100 billion on tackling rising sea levels over the long term. So for us, I would say here in Singapore, I think that was the start of a lot of renaissance in climate interest, even after the Paris Agreement was inked in 2015. But I guess Mel can tell you a bit more about that evolution later. But I'm here just to share my perspectives on identifying stories at the intersection of our trade and the environment, especially now, when there's so much interest in climate change, in sustainability. And it's really heartening to hear the questions that came out just now for Jen, and greenwashing will be something that I'll be talking about. So yeah, my slides are really basic, but I was just, there are some parts missing. But anyway, I just thought that we could talk a bit more about some of the potential stories that could arise from this reporting on this intersection. One of it would be, I think, before I talk about opportunities, would be the cost of business as usual. Around the world, we have seen fossil fuel sectors cutting jobs. So I think that is definitely one area of interest. For Singapore specifically, we've seen our petrochemical giants, Shell and ExxonMobil, axing a huge number of jobs. I think for Shell, it was like quite a significant number, like half or 1/3 of their refinery workforce. So there's always the cost of business as usual. And right now, with the extreme weather events playing out worldwide, we are also seeing the cost of transition, cost of physical losses and damages to infrastructure that would affect how economies are running. So that's definitely one thing to consider in looking at identifying stories in the green transition. Then, of course, there are opportunities. So, for example, what Jen was talking about, carbon markets, that is such a huge area of interest, which not many people might be familiar with now. And I mean, based on our reporting, every time we come up with explainers on what is green finance, what are carbon markets, what are carbon services, these stories always do very well, not just Singapore, but internationally as well. So that's something that we track. Other things to consider would be the tensions between biodiversity and climate. So, for instance, we are seeing a huge push for renewable energy now as governments try to cut their carbon footprint in order to meet their Paris Agreement targets. But sometimes this is coming at a cost to biodiversity, especially here in Asia. The demand for energy in Asia is growing so rapidly. And so governments are trying to put renewable energy projects in what they perceive as empty plots of land. But what humans think as empty may not entirely be the case. So recently I did this interview with a conservation group that talked about how in India, there's a bird that's found only in the subcontinent and nowhere else in the world called the Great Indian Bustard. And because these are grassland birds, but yet when you have renewable energy projects mushrooming up all across the grasslands, which people think are empty because they're not rainforests, they are not like super biodiverse places, and you have power lines popping up all over the place, these birds are one of the biggest, heaviest flying birds. So they don't fly high and they always end up crashing into the power lines. And as a result, you get, I think there are fewer than 100 of these birds left in the world. And it could turn out that our renewable energy push could be driving species to extinction even before climate change drives them to extinction. So these are some possible stories that we can consider, when we talk about environmental sustainability. It's not just only about climate, it's also about biodiversity. The planet is facing more than one crisis at the same time. So how can we strike a balance between the two? How can we call out, how can we make people realize that these two don't necessarily have to be at tensions? So another example is, especially with a lot of regional cross-collaboration nowadays, not just in terms of carbon markets, but in terms of renewable energy imports. So Singapore recently announced that we're going to import, or we have started importing green energy from hydropower dams in Laos. But hydropower dams they don't have the best environmental credentials, right? Every time you build these structures, it comes at a cost to biodiversity. You have the Mekong giant catfish critically endangered and getting worse because of these structures. And not only just in terms of environment, it's also about people, which I guess we can talk a bit more about, the social impacts of carbon projects. Communities always get displaced whenever a dam is being built. So there's also that tension over there. And even further afield, there's an Australian company, Sun Cable, that wants to lay a very, very long cable from a solar farm in Darwin all the way to supply electricity in Singapore. There will also be an environmental cost to that, and also there's geopolitics. So it's something to consider, whenever we talk about sustainability and climate, it's not the only factor to consider in reporting on such issues. Yeah, but also there are solutions out there. So one thing I find in climate change reporting is that it cannot be super doom and gloom. We need to show people that there are solutions out there and how people can better strike this balance. So in the example of, the biodiversity and climate tensions, there's a conservation group, BirdLife International, that got funding from the Asian Development Bank to actually build a mapping tool, which is free for use. It's called AVISTEP, AVISTEP. So what it does is it maps out potential renewable energy. It maps out where in 4 countries, India, Nepal, Vietnam, and Thailand, you can actually put a renewable energy project, whether it's a solar project or a wind farm, and power lines in a way that's least harmful to biodiversity. So I think these are tools that, as media, if we report on it, it will at least let companies know that there are solutions out there and it's not just an either-or kind of thing. Yeah. And yeah, another thing to consider definitely is greenwashing. It's not showing up on the slides, but we can talk a bit more about that, greenwashing. So whenever a company, I don't know whether you guys face the same issues, but as an environment journalist, every day I get like 10 emails telling me that you want to reach net zero. I'm like, okay, sure, but how are you going to get there, right? So if you have so many emails about net zero, how do you assess which one is really newsworthy, which companies are genuine? So one thing I'll consider is, okay, you'll reach net zero. Firstly, do you have an action plan of how to get there, right? And if you do have an action plan, how much do carbon credits factor in? So I do believe strongly in, as Jen said, carbon credits actually providing revenue for carbon projects. But that has to be after you try to reduce your emissions in the first place, right? If you are a major petrochemical company, how much of your emissions do you want to offset with carbon credits? Because unless you're actually doing something to reduce your carbon footprint, that it's no point. So I think that's one big greenwashing thing that we can, call companies out on. The second is simple things like, are they just hopping on an international bandwagon? So net zero is now the new international bandwagon, but before there was net zero, there was plastic. So I think it's very important for journalists to understand context as well. From Singapore, for instance, because all our trash is incinerated. And by the way, our waste to energy plant is also a source of carbon credits, right? Later Mel can talk about that. We incinerate our plastic. So having a biodegradable polymer bag is actually worse for our environment. And there was a study done by the Nanyang Technological University, another university here, that actually found that unless you have a reusable bag and you've used it 100 times, that's the best option. But the second best option is actually a single-use plastic bag. It's actually more harmful to the environment to use a paper bag than a plastic bag, because the resources going into making a paper bag is more harmful than making a single-use plastic bag. And in Singapore, we can reuse our single-use plastic bag because of our high-rise nature, and you can throw everything in and throw it away. So context is very important, and I think it differs because all of us come from different countries, and assessing the environmental benefits of each of these things would be quite important. And it's very easy for retailers, to jump on the bandwagon and say, I'm going to do this because the whole world is doing that. I want to save the sea turtle from having a plastic straw up in its nose. But it's up to us, I think, to call people out on it. Yeah. So, these are just some topics that we can consider. The rest of my presentation, I'll just focus on different ways of telling that story and how we have tried to do it at the Straits Times. So some things to consider about your audience is the level of expertise. So I think some of you come from very trade-focused publications. Your audience will probably have a deeper level of understanding compared to if you are writing for a general audience. For us at the Straits Times, we are a national newspaper, so we write for a broad range of audiences. We do have very, very specific ones that is more tailored for businesses, but also very simple tools, infographics, comic strips, and podcasts, which I'll show you in a bit. Yeah, so format is important. Yeah, and lastly, greenwashing, I've talked about it already. So just briefly show you some examples of what we have done. Okay, I'm not sure whether I can play a video, but in the lead up to COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference last year, we did a series of comic strips that was published in the newspapers that show why climate change is important. So we had a four-part series. This was the final one on why this event was so important. But the first one talked about, what are the impacts of climate change? What does it mean to adapt to climate change? What does global warming even mean? So this was also printed out and distributed to all secondary schools in Singapore. We thought that it would be a good primer for them to explore further. So this was what happened. Oh, and one thing we tried to do is we realized that every time we talk about climate change, the narrative has always been dominated by the West. So that's why, even in Asia, you have kids who are more familiar with hummingbirds, which we don't have here, instead of sunbirds, which we do have here, and they are very closely related. So one thing we tried to do in this story was to use narrators that are found in Singapore. So this is the fourth one, you can't really see it, but our main protagonist was a black-necked oriole, which I'm sure you guys have seen during your time in Singapore. It's a super urban adapted bird. It's bright yellow with black eyes. It's beautiful. And we thought that, actually all these small subliminal signs can actually show how we can reach out to our audiences better and make the topic more relatable, instead of like, you know, we don't have toucans here, but yet kids know toucans, they don't know our hornbills. So things like that. And the other one is the Arctic squaw. So we use Arctic squaw as a tool to tell black-necked oriole about the impacts of the world. And coincidentally, the Arctic squaw also makes an appearance in Singapore during the migratory season, which is between September and March. So also very scientifically accurate. We always fact check with the scientists before we do such things. So this was what happened in print, but we also adapted it for online. It was a series of 4 Instagram stories that you can click, that shows the different panels. So I guess it's also a lot about working with your colleagues. Like if we are journalists, we can't do everything ourselves. We need to work with people who can draw. We need people who can, you just have to know what are the advantages or the strengths of your colleagues and try to work together to get the best product out. Yeah. Okay, so this was something a bit more technical. So in the lead up to COP26, there was huge media interest in this conference last year, but I think there was not really much clarity about why exactly this conference was so important. So this was basically to convince my editors why they should send us there. That we knew enough about this topic to be able to cover it well. So we know that the Paris Agreement was inked in 2015, but at that point, the Paris Agreement set out broad targets, right? And Mel's expert, she can tell you more about, you know, limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that was the 2015 architecture. But how to get there? Remember we talked about action plan. So the subsequent COPs were supposed to hammer out this action plan that will help us achieve this Paris Agreement target. So, but this action plan still had a lot of holes. So in this infographic, we highlighted what are like some of the 6 missing pieces. And like if you notice the jigsaw and the Paris Eiffel Tower there, it's just to show like, you know, these are some of the issues that have to be hammered out in order for the Paris Agreement to be enforced. So one of the key ones was on carbon markets, which I think Jen already provided a very good overview. And yeah, so I mean, I think these are some visual tools that we try to use. If not, if you imagine this in an entire text, just in a body of text, it will be harder for people to understand because some of it can get really technical. Also, many thanks to Mel because she helped me fact check a lot of things. Yeah. So this is, I also co-host a podcast series with David. David is the Straits Times climate change editor. And surprisingly, these are our top 2 podcast episodes ever. So it's about green finance. We talked about what green finance is, how is it different from sustainable finance, what is it different from ESG, and the second part focused on what are carbon services. Because this is something that we hear bandied about, but not many people actually, I mean, I didn't know what it was until I did this episode. So I think this is another tool. And surprisingly, our podcast, I think our audience is very different because we have a huge business interest in our podcast episodes. Yeah, and we can track that because basically everyone on this panel has been on our podcast before. Jen hasn't, but soon. Yeah. Although we did interview her colleague, Mikkel. So basically we talk about different aspects of climate change through this series. And every time we talk about like green finance, Article 6, carbon markets, the rise of carbon, what are voluntary carbon markets, how they are different from compliance markets, they always do so well. They like bring us to the top of the chart. So I think there's a lot of interest in this area and not many people know about it yet because it's so new. But yeah, these are just some of the tools that I guess we can all explore in telling story about climate change and the energy transition. So now over to Mel.
Take questions.
Hi, my name is Shakur and I'm from Press Trust of India, New Delhi. So my question is, you talked about calling out these companies on the big claims that that they make. How easy is it in Singapore to do such things? Given that these big corporates are in cohorts with the government. So.
Yeah, I know Singapore doesn't rank very highly on Press Freedom Index. However, I've never felt constrained in my reporting because I always ensure that I have facts to back me up. So I will never publish an anonymous source story unless I can verify that with numerous anonymous sources from different companies, which usually hasn't happened yet. Sometimes, no matter how controversial an issue is, you can always find someone to talk to you. So I would also say use data. right? Once you have data, it's very hard to.
Do you feel like pulls and pressures from various quarters, when you're reporting on some big company?
Definitely. Not directly in Singapore, but sometimes when you report on agroforestry issues, I'm not sure if there are any journalists from Indonesia here. Those companies can get quite aggressive. Yeah, but as long as you have the data to back you up. When you talk about fires, there's always hotspot data, satellite maps, satellite imagery, and yeah. So I always pursue stories in a way that will also protect myself from lawsuits and all that. So having data is very important. Cross-checking with more than one source is very important as well. Yeah. And there are some things that people just, I guess, cannot run away from. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I don't claim to know all the answers. I'm still learning, but yeah, maybe I can learn. You guys can share some tips about reporting from your own countries as well.
Thanks.
Okay. Hi everyone. Hi, I'm Melissa. I and also wanted to thank the National Press Foundation for the invitation to come and speak to you. As you can tell, it's shifting the gears a little bit, right? This is more of a personal sharing about my experience working with the media from a researcher angle, from an academic angle. So I've just put up this slide here to tell you a little bit about who I am, what I do. I spent most of my career looking at energy policy issues in Singapore, and I moved very recently to the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at the same in NUS, National University of Singapore. Outside of work, and this will come into play a bit later, I do a lot of volunteering. One of my outside of work activities that I like very much is something called Books and Beer, which we swap books and drink beer. And I think having that persona, doing recycling and really living the environmental lifestyle, if you think about it, really does help in terms of being engaged with the public, having that sort of reputation, if you will. It kind of can help as well in work. And then there are a bunch of other councils as well that I'm on. National Youth Council, the Ministry of Sustainability and Environment, Eco Fund, and the Climate Action SG Alliance. So just a little bit of background. So what I do at work really is research. And as a researcher, you have to publish. I think Lynette will attest to that. But we also do a lot of collaboration with colleagues on grant calls. We do webinars and do engagement. And a lot of my time is spent on maintaining competency in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Paris Agreement, and their key developments. So a lot of work behind the scenes. At times this doesn't really pay off in terms of academic publications. Nobody really sort of in Singapore wants to fund research like that, but you do it anyway because people do ask you. So keeping up data and maintaining competency is a huge part of researchers' time and role. And of course, we have to respond to stakeholder needs. There's something in Singapore, I don't know whether in your various jurisdictions and contexts, people do keep a list of key opinion leaders, whether it's the government or otherwise, you do have a list of people, contacts that you might want to contact for different issues. So I understand from some friends that actually myself and a couple other people in Singapore are like on these lists. And that's why you get contacted so often, I guess, for things. And you just need to prioritize your time. Yeah, so the next slide I think was going to be about media experience in my line of work. So as Audrey sort of started to mention already, I work a lot with her, and I'm really actually very proud of her work in the Straits Times. And so you can see, as a researcher, actually, media doesn't count for a lot, when it comes to promotions and stuff. Really nobody really bothers about like media engagements and how many sort of quotes you get in the papers and all that. But I think particularly with regard to climate change and environmental issues, these are some of the mediums I personally feel are very important to engage the public. Nobody wants to read, not say nobody, but like people don't really want to read like a 30-page journal article about climate change. So over the years, I've set the intention to actually work more with platforms like the Straits Times and others like Channel News Asia to help raise public awareness. But not everybody thinks that way. If you're on the tenure track, you're on the educator track, you may not have the time and bandwidth for it. So as a journalist, maybe good to think about who and where they're at in their careers so that you can build that trust and rapport as well. So the mediums really have been, for me, I tried to do my research, publish the research in more accessible mediums. So policy briefs are not just good for people in the business and industry, but also for journalists, right? To really get a bite-sized sort of analysis about what's going on at the COP meetings or developments in Singapore, for example. You can see Audrey and I in the studio at the Straits Times recording a podcast. I think this was pre-Madrid, COP25 in Madrid. The Climate Conversations from Channel News Asia is also a really great podcast. Jamie Ho used to run it. There's other platforms like radio. Radio also invites people. So this is the Breakfast Huddle by Money FM, also SPH. And then on TV, Channel News Asia. So, oops, okay. Anyway, next slide. The key takeaways that I have really is, I think trust is really important. I think knowing your contact well and who they are and what they're representing, who they're representing is really important. Climate change is really difficult to report on. So quite often the researchers, if you contact us, you need to be a bit patient. We sometimes have to set the context for you, why this has to be reported or potentially could be reported in this way. We like to explain a lot, cite papers or sources so that we maintain our reputation as well, right? So if you are a researcher, you don't want to sound stupid or dumb or worse, wrong, right? So it involves a lot of nuance, and how to get that into that column it's your challenge, but we usually try to explain a lot. I wanted to mention OB markers, out-of-bound markers, because if researchers' funding comes from particular sources, it ends up sometimes coming out in their interviews as well, right? So they want to protect certain interests. So I think that's good to be mindful of. What are these OB markers, out-of-bound markers for your contact, for example? Trust, I just want to add that I actually had some really bad experiences with media. So please don't do this. When somebody says things are off the record, I know I don't have to emphasize this, but somebody says it's off the record, please keep it off the record, because it can damage your relationship with your contact. I've had somebody, when I said off the record, they still published it, and I had a call from the government about what I supposedly had said I had said it off the record, right? Just to give context to that journalist. And of course, I was very upset after that. So I never worked with him again, right? So fair warning, right? Preparation is really key for whoever you're contacting and getting on as an interviewee. It's not always possible, of course. Sometimes you have really tight deadlines, but do think about maybe if you have a press release ahead of time, maybe you can give a sound out your contact ahead of time if you're close enough with them. Sometimes I get a WhatsApp message. Hey, can I, Audrey sends me a WhatsApp message. Just a heads up, I'm going to send you a bunch of questions. And that's what I did for budget this year, right? Budget 2022. I written up all my thoughts into a Google Doc. And then when the interviews came in fast and furious, I just sort of like copy and pasted more or less, and then edited as I went along, depending on the context of the question and which platform it was. So it relieves us of a lot of stress, right? As a person that has to maintain reputation and all that comes to bear. I wanted to say also that it's good to have rapport, because sometimes things that we say are cobbled together, or we have to think about it very quickly. So having a way to communicate edits quickly, whether it's via WhatsApp or email, so sometimes every now and then I get a message from Audrey saying, can I write it this way? Is it still accurate? I think that's really helpful for both, obviously the paper that you're writing for and the contact. I wanted to add the last point really is live interviews. Okay, please, not all researchers have media training, so please bear with us. Not everyone is really good at like speaking and going on TV. We're very nervous at times, so if you can spare some time to prepare and ask if somebody needs help preparing, that would be really fantastic. So for example, one of the podcasts that I did with Audrey, I actually had a Google Doc going, and I sent it to her in advance. Like, this is what I think I'm going to say. And then, they sort of said, okay, great, then we'll use this as material. I don't know if it's always available to you, this option of preparing your guests ahead of time, but I would strongly recommend it if you can. I would say that live interviews, again, for not all researchers want to go and have that media presence and go out there, so you might have some trouble getting them. And the ones who do probably talk a lot and you have to cut away a lot of things, right? So, but it is very good for mindshare, and it helps build that individual's reputation, recognition, and thought leadership. So happy to take any questions, and thanks very much for having me.
Great.
Hi, Sunny Efron from National Press Foundation. I want to thank you all again for making time. I want to bring this conversation back to a conversation that's happening in the United States, and also to the questions that Sunny and some of the other fellows asked about sort of the differences in the way this is covered. One big story that's brewing in the US environmental movement right now, as I'm sure you know, is what is the value of a forest that's standing? And so if you cut an old forest, obviously the carbon footprint is greater than, so it's not the same as just planting new trees, right? And every year that you leave the forest standing, it's more carbon sequestered, and therefore, how do we compensate, first, how do we compensate landowners who don't cut their forests? And how do they get green credit for not doing something, and leaving it to grow? And second, particularly since Singapore itself has had this problem with the Sumatra forests being burned, and of course the air, the dirty air moving over into Singapore year after year. Is there any attempt in Asia that maybe isn't going on in the US to make climate mitigation or climate credits about forests that are not cut, or other climate damage that does not happen?
I think Jen,
You can take the first.
you can go ahead first.
So the first question, I think, was around the value of a forest that's left standing versus avoiding one that's about to be cut. I think for those who don't understand why there's a question or attention there, it's helpful probably to start with how typically forestry credits are given. A project usually has to prove that in this patch of forest, generally, let's say 5% of the trees get cut every year. And by doing the project, that 5% that they avoid getting cut, that's what they get the credits for. So that's kind of typically how these types of projects work. What that creates is a strange incentive to say that if a patch of forest was never really under threat, and that sort of deforestation wasn't happening to it, typically very rich, biodiverse places, then those patches of forest deep within certain areas don't get credits because they're just not at threat, right? And you can play that out and imagine then, does it mean that we should all be, as a baseline, starting to deforest so that we can claim those credits? So there is now, I think, a movement. You see it both with the National Climate Solutions Alliance, which is born out of the West, as well as many other kind of global new standards, trees, for example, that are trying to recommend preservation as kind of as important as, or even more important than that sort of avoided deforestation activity. I think at the heart of it, again, it comes back to the science, right? If you imagine the carbon budget is a tub, there's water flowing in and there's water flowing out, and you're trying to avoid it overflowing. The preservation bit basically makes sure that the amount of water going in, you slow the flow, and then the avoided deforestation bit also does the same. They have that sort of same activity. I think what we want to avoid is that unintended incentive around, you have to deforest to get credits, be the impetus for landowners to feel like I need to show damage to be able to get credits. And so at the heart of it, I think you'll see a new standard standing up. It's called trees. They're trying to help
protect large swaths of forest altogether and actually pay for what we call HFLD credits. So credits that essentially say the forest is standing, you should preserve it, someone should be paying for its preservation. I think what can be uncomfortable is for the investors putting money behind those types of credits. It's that if my money didn't go to that project, is the world any worse off? Right? That is the tension. But I think the conversation right now, or the evolution of this should be an also and. We should be preserving and avoiding deforestation. So how exactly we pay for it and the relative so-called premiums associated with it, I think the market will sort that out. But I think no one is saying one is more important than the other.
Can I just jump in here?
Yeah.
Actually, I have a question for you. What about co-benefits? Because an old forest will have a richer assemblage of species, and you may have critically endangered species in that forest, in an old forest that a new forest may not have yet. So does that factor into the carbon price?
So it does on some level, but I think the markets are also, there are different actors, and the way you use the carbon credits affect whether or not people are willing to pay for that premium. If you're a company that is fundamentally trying to make a claim or an emissions neutralization activity against either a compliance movement where the government only cares about the carbon component, even if you paid for biodiversity to protect it, your willingness to pay for the utility you get from that is much lower. Versus if you were a consumer goods company selling, for example, cereal or milk powder, and your consumer set really cares that you're protecting biodiversity and supporting local communities, then essentially your marketing mileage on that sort of activity is higher, right? And so it really, is down to who's using that credit and whether or not you're going to get recognition for it to some extent. I think for us, at least the Housing Associates, we do think impact matters to quality, because if you actually kind of go down the path of by helping local communities, finding alternative livelihoods, it actually increases the permanence of that carbon sequestration because the temptation to deforest is reduced when you're also accounting for all of those things, right? You don't protect the trees just for the trees alone, it's also for everything else that is relying on it in the ecosystem. So right now, I think in the market, you do see actually typically projects that do well really on biodiversity and community benefits do price higher than those that don't. So it is paid for by the market, but only by the companies that get the mileage out of it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, my question is to Jen. You said that 36% of the S&P 500 are buying carbon credits, right? So how big is the government clientele? How many governments are coming and buying? And where does South Asian nation, where do they fit in this whole thing? Are they coming to you, trading on your platform, buying carbon credits?
So I think if you start with the voluntary action, right, not the compliance action, the companies looking to do this are typically companies who have already an explicit carbon or transition plan, sustainability holistically, or even if it's just carbon loan. And in general, the maturity of this is just higher in Western nations. So if you just look through, for example, companies with an SBTi target, there are about 2,000 of them. I wouldn't be surprised if the large majority are coming from Western nations. So I think they just kind of a little bit ahead of the curve on this. For most developing nations, I think this is also evolving. Like there are companies starting to really care about this, and actually, given where we are situated in the world as CIX, we do have a more Asian-leaning clientele. That said, I think it's also an opportunity because many of these companies are thinking about how could we also be suppliers of these sorts of credits, not just buyers. That stat, I think, is mostly buyers. You mentioned it on the slide. With regards to countries, I think it's really early days. What we're seeing now is that most countries are dealing with carbon credits that have what we call a corresponding adjustment, because what countries care about is their national targets. And on that, those are typically the credits you see under Article 6, which I'm sure Mel can give more insight to than me actually. But on that, it's typically if a country knows that they're going to fall short of their targets, they're going to look for another country to buy some of those from. And right now, I think globally, these are literally done on a bilateral basis. It's like country-to-country negotiations. So they're not typically brokered in open exchanges today because it's really early days. But you start to see, I think, there was a series of, Scandinavian nations who've been buying from countries like Thailand, as well as in broadly Southeast Asia and South Asia.
And one question to Lynette. You mentioned about the e-commerce companies and carbon footprints. Regulation-wise, have you seen any country bringing in, like for instance, India is developing its e-commerce policy. It's not out yet, but have you seen a mention of carbon emission and footprint in any of the e-commerce policies in the Asian nation or Western world?
I think it's broadly on a national level, not specific to that particular industry, but I think they are more aware of the costs to businesses too, right? The congestion that they encounter, switching to electric might pay off in the total cost of ownership perspective. So they are evolving towards it, but I don't think it's sort of mandated specifically for the e-commerce and transport and logistics industry.
Okay.
Hi. Yes, since there are researchers on the panel, I would like to ask this question.
Is it on?
Yeah. So how much of peer-reviewed research has happened ever since this idea was floated about the impact of carbon taxes on reducing the carbon footprint, and also how much is the EV sector, how much is it sustainable in the whole scheme of things to reduce carbon footprints?
EVs, right? Electric vehicles.
Maybe
I'll take the second question. I don't know.
Yeah, so for the first question, I think that the peer-reviewed papers and research is, inconclusive at this moment about whether carbon tax and climate policies in general do result in actual emissions reduction, depending again on the country, the context. My own observation is partly because, obviously things have the world has changed, right, in the last few years. It's been COVID, there's been recovery. But I think what I would look towards is that as countries recover from the pandemic and also thinking about the current energy crisis, I would be more concerned about whether countries are actually going to be on track to meet their nationally determined contributions in 2030 and to keep us on track for 1.5 or 2 degree Celsius warming, right? Or will it be beyond? So I think this is the current concern that researchers and people are tackling. Not to mention all the waste that's coming out of like delivery and things like that because of the pandemic, right? So my sense is that, to also with other questions that were mentioned earlier, I think a really great resource for everyone is to look at whichever country you're reporting on, look at their nationally determined contribution. What have they committed to, right, exactly under the Paris Agreement, and whether they're making progress towards it. And I think that would be reporting in the present and looking into the future. I mean, the past is important as well, but like I said, I understand it's quite inconclusive, for most places.
Maybe I'll take the question on electric vehicles. It's really exciting time now. We see a lot of electrification happening on mobility around many cities. I think on the life cycle perspective, whether or not it competes with the diesel or the petrol equivalent depends very much on the nature of the grid, electricity grid from which we charge these vehicles. So if we are powering our vehicles with coal-fired power plant, that's not very helpful from a climate perspective, from an clean air perspective. But if it's a cleaner source of fuel, then we can do that. That's why this story about electrification of vehicles has to be accompanied with the greening of the grid. If not, it just doesn't make total sense.
But there is this issue of mining for semiconductors for EVs, and also the infrastructure that has to be built. That's huge.
Right, the charging infrastructure that has to be there to accompany this growth. We're witnessing that now in Singapore too. We're trying to ramp up the charging facilities, and it has to keep pace with demand. That's why it's so tricky, right? And there are lots of other environmental issues that we speak of. The scarcity of some of the materials needed to be built into the batteries, or the recovery of recycled or end of life batteries once the vehicle is retired. So lots of issues. It's not a perfect green solution also, but it's if we're talking about climate and reductions, electrification is one of the best options that we have on the table today.
Hi, thank you for your insights. This question, any of the panelists can take this question. There's a perception that going green involves a lot of costs. even in the manufacturing sector when they want to replace the processes. The manufacturers feel that it's going to incur a lot of cost. At the same time, access to financing to finance this kind of procedures is not ample. So what is being done on that area? How are banks evaluating these kind of moves? And also, this specific question to Melissa, you spoke off the record, journalists quoted and you got a call. I'm just wondering how blunt can you be on environmental issues in Singapore? Can you be outright, can you say something outright? Thank you.
Maybe I'll take the first question because it's a lot about balancing doom and gloom. So in terms of striking that balance, this perception about cost, I think in the initial phase, there will definitely have to be a bit of a cost premium in the adoption of some technologies, simply because it's new. But we have seen certain things come down in cost. Actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Jen. Vera has stopped certifying renewable energy projects as carbon credit sources. Have they?
No, it's large grid connected ones, yes.
Yeah.
Still in small pockets they do.
So Vera is a body that kind of certifies a carbon credit. So just now Jen showed the different types of carbon credits. And apparently Vera, one of the internationally recognized bodies, has stopped certifying credits generated by large-scale grid-connected power plants because it's no longer additional, right? Because the cost of renewables have come down so much that it is business sense for you to just straight away invest in a renewable energy plant rather than a coal-fired plant. I mean, Jen can talk a bit more about that. So I think it depends. For EVs right now, I think there might be a certain hump, but it could come down in the long term. And also there's a lot of research into recycling of EV batteries in order to reduce the extractive nature of mining for the materials. So there's that one thing. In terms of finance, I think that will be a major issue of discussion at this year's climate change conference. So developed countries had in 2009 promised the developing world that they will channel $100 billion US climate finance every year, but they have fallen short of this goal. So this year we expect, because COP is going to be held in an African country, in Egypt, there's likely to be a lot of focus on asking developed countries to not only make good on their initial promise, but to give more money. Because just now we were talking about historical blame, right? Who is the one contributing to climate change? And not just in terms of helping them access financing for mitigation projects, which is like renewable energy plants, but also adaptation, like, building seawalls, adapting to sea level rise. So I think that will be something at this year's climate change conference.
The first question on manufacturing, you're absolutely right. It's very expensive to retrofit, and it's also about timing. So for some companies, right, like in Singapore, I know it's not manufacturing power, for example, we talk about best in class. Right now, for natural gas turbines, best in class is H class. But Singapore, most of the companies are using F class turbines. So you do the alphabet, it's actually not very far, right? And companies, they just don't change their turbines so often. So the reality is that you have technology locked in. That's number one. Second is, even though like Singapore government said that they put the carbon tax at $5 a ton, right, from 2019 to 2023, and they said, we'll recycle the money into like energy efficiency grants and everything. Yeah, but how many companies actually went to pursue those grants? Some of the concerns I've observed is partly because sometimes maybe their lease is up, right? For manufacturing plants, they have only a 15-year lease. Why would they invest in retrofitting the plant? Maybe they'll just take some money for pumps and lighting, change to LED lighting and things. Nothing that is consequential for the manufacturing line. Because keeping in mind that the multinational companies, they don't make decisions here in Singapore. It's in Japan or in the US, right? Quite often the headquarters. So if companies were to take a portfolio approach, they may not think of Singapore as their top priority in terms of the retrofits, right? So they might think of it more long-term or in the future. The other thing is regulation, how it's enforced, right? So for example, the Energy Conservation Act in Singapore, it requires companies that are liable to report to actually submit energy efficiency improvement plans to like 10% of improvement, but it's not enforced, right? So the government doesn't actually go and tell the companies, hey, how have you achieved your 10%? It's just a plan, right? So I think, and the final thing is, if you apply for the grants, quite often you are required, it triggers some form of compliance and reporting, right? Because you have to make good on the money that you've spent on retrofitting. So you allow people to go into your plant and look at your processes, which may be, something you don't really want them to do, right? Especially when the industry is very small and there's issues with confidentiality and things like that. To the second question, which is on how bluntly you can say things in Singapore, I think it really boils down to who you are and what kind of risk you're willing to take, right? So I'll give you one really concrete example, and Audrey was involved in this. So the Climate Action Tracker, some of you may have heard of this platform, right? They wrote a piece about, they said about Singapore that our targets were critically insufficient, right? And then, can I say this? Okay, she had a lot of trouble finding anybody to be quoted in the papers, right? Like, how like nobody wants to put their name to either agreeing with the Climate Action Tracker saying that they were right or contradicting the government, right? So I ended up saying, okay, I will give you something that sort of don't get me into trouble, but also allows you to like put out a quote by someone, right? So I think again, it really boils down to your rapport with individuals, like so-called experts in the country. And also their individual willingness to like take that risk, take that plunge to say something that may invite controversy, may invite some criticism, but they're willing to put it out there because like I'm willing to because I've been in this for like 12 years, right? I know what people think of me. I know they trust me. So it's fine for me.
But, sorry, one more. Yeah. But do you sit in various councils, right? So when you go back to governments or Singaporean government, for example, you tell them that, hey, this year you fell short from this particular target. How do they take it? Do they take it seriously or they are like, no, maybe next year?
Yeah, I'm actually one of the more critical people on the boards and councils. And I give them a lot of grief like at these meetings. And so it's like for me, it's important to show up to these meetings. Because I would say that just going into the details of certain projects that are being funded, it really does make a difference when you ask questions and not just, approve the projects just because they look good and, have supposed objectives that are being met, right? Deliverables. I would say that the hierarchy, the bureaucracy in Singapore seems pretty flat, but because there are interagencies, work groups, so the Interministerial Committee on Climate Change is quite high level, is chaired by, of course, I think it's Teo Chee Hian, right? SM Teo Chee Hian, and then it trickles down to all of the permanent secretaries in Singapore. So those decisions are made at a fairly high level, but if you have very good contacts with the working level staff, I think you can have really open and candid conversations with them, maybe over drinks and dinner as opposed to like formal meetings. And I think at our age is probably more likely because, in our 30s, we've grown up with these people like the last 10, 12 years. So maybe find folks that like in your age group, your peers that you can sort of establish a rapport with. And I think maybe with COVID, we've lost a little bit of that, lost some time on establishing meaningful connections with people. So I think we should definitely be engaging in person a bit more to build that back.
Final question goes to Stella.
Hi, this is from the Wall Street Journal. I have two questions. One is there an organization or a regulator that tracks green financing in China? Because the Chinese government definitely allocate a lot of financial resources to encourage banks to lend to these so-called green projects. But I'm just wondering if we can have more transparency in terms of how these money are spent. And second is, China went through a power crunch last fall, and that kind of set back the country's overall goal in terms of achieving carbon neutrality. And we're in the middle of the war in Ukraine, and with energy price rising, do you see more countries will kind of delay their long-term plan of pursuing green energy and in exchange for energy security in the short term?
Just to add to her question, the second question, is there any impact of fuel prices on carbon footprints? And if it is, like, how does it impact?
I can't say for the whole world, but I can tell you that there is quite a fair bit of concern that countries are going to roll back their nationally determined contribution targets, right? They won't be able to meet them, or they won't be able to submit new ones this year, because under the Glasgow Climate Pact, the UK government, sort of had the final outcome to say that countries are invited to submit new targets in 2020 instead of the next window, which is 2025, right? 5-year Paris ratchet up mechanism. So I think we might not see as many ambitious targets this year ahead of COP27. There are two ways of seeing it, I guess, right? Rolling back, one, because they have to go back to coal or oil because gas prices are so expensive, or they're locked into pipelines, right? And they really have no choice, right? The other way of seeing it is that this energy crisis is pushing countries to think about renewable energy, more secure forms of renewable energy, because to overcome that energy security issue with infrastructure like piped gas and so on. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's going to be a mix of reactions, and we'll only start to see that as this drags on. Yeah.
I think it also depends on how countries are reacting to this crisis, depends on how energy secure they are with their current mix. So for countries rolling back their climate pledges like Germany, it's because Germany depends they're over reliant on one Russian gas pipeline, right? So when that suddenly shut off, they have to scramble, restart their coal plants and all that. But for Singapore, I mean, we are definitely affected by the energy prices, but because we are already importing almost all our energy, we are very well aware of the need to, diversify our energy portfolio. So even after Singapore increased its electricity prices over a few quarters, the government still released a report saying that, our electricity grid can go net zero by 2050. So to me, from the communications perspective, I was pleasantly surprised in a way, because at the same time you're reading about all other countries suddenly rolling back, and then Singapore government issue a report saying that, we can reach our electricity sector can reach net zero by 2050, and here's how. So I think it really depends on your current situation, because Singapore already imports a lot of its energy, and it's really already trying to diversify our energy supplies. But that also hinges on a few other factors like geopolitical cooperation, whether regional carbon markets, whether regional electricity grids can be set up. So I think these are all factors to consider. But just based on my reading of, they could have chosen not to publish the report at that point and made it public, because the report was done in 2020 or 2020, just before, or 2021, just before the Russia invaded Ukraine. So to me, they didn't have to publish it at that point, but they still did.